Right, it's about time. Okay, so welcome everyone to this Biodiversity for Sustainable Cities webinar series 2024 of the APRU. Okay, so if you can click next slide. So today is the webinar 2. So we have two distinguished scholars, Dr. Babara Ribeiro and also Professor Dieter Hochuli. So who are going to give us the talks on the relating topic. But allow me to use a few minutes to introduce you. Why are we going to have this webinar series? If you can click next slide. So the APRU, I mean, the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, comprised of 61 leading research universities in Asia Pacific. So as a network of leading universities linking Americas, Asia, Australasia, I mean, the APRU brings together through leaders, researchers, and policymakers to exchange ideas and collaborate on practical solutions for the challenges of the 21st century. So the whole idea is to leverage our members' collective education and also research capabilities into the international public policy process. So this is what we are trying to do. And if you can click next slide, please. So, there are lots of key research-related programs that we try to resolve for one specific challenges. Of course, this aligns very well with the 17 SDGs that everyone is very familiar with. There are many different groups inside the APRU, ranging from global health, multi-hazards, Pacific Ocean biodiversity, digital economy, sustainable cities and landscapes, and also sustainable waste and management. So again, if you're interested, I mean, please feel free to visit the website. I'm not going to read that more. If you can go to the next slide, please. So today, I mean, this webinar series is actually coming from arranging by two major groups. The one is, if you can see on the screen, Yikan is here. Yikan and also Alfamo, I mean, there is on the sustainable cities and landscape, which again, I mean, which is working on the urban cities, biodiversity, and also social science. A very, very broad theme, but also very integrative. Again, there are lots of details inside. Please visit the website. If you can go to the next slide. Again, I mean, the other one that today the SEL and also the biodiversity group. The biodiversity group are mainly more biologists or ecologists trying to understand the science of this more than 9 million species of biodiversity in this Pacific Rim. If you can go to the next slide. So before we start the photo session, which we will request you if you can turn on your camera. There was a lot of people that means to thank. Of course, we need to thank Yikan, Fei Mu, Nathan Low, Caroline Hawk from University of Sydney, Yin and Olivia and Amy from Chinese University of Hong Kong, and also Benjamin and Christina from APRU to make this possible. So now can I kindly invite everyone to turn on your camera, and then we can take a photo before we have the two distinguished scholars to share their research with us. Okay. As I know it's a morning or evening, but feel free if you can. Okay, so okay, I presume it must be a very early morning. So again, if you can, yes, please.
Take one more photo. Yes. One. Okay, there's something. Some participant comment. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So Olivia, if you can share the screen again, please. So right, okay, so good morning and also good evening again. So now, okay, so we have two speakers today. So the first one is going to be Babara. So Babara is now a lecturer in the sustainability team in the School of Humanities, Arts and Social Science in Murdoch University of Australia. She is also a certified sustainability consultant and published scientific papers on and technical reports about pathways to more sustainable futures, and has worked with businesses, governments, and research centers in different parts of the world. Okay, so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please kindly welcome Dr. Ribeiro. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Jerome, for the introduction. And thanks so much for the whole APRU team for facilitating this session and enabling this opportunity to talk about our research. I'll start sharing my screen now. Hopefully that will go well. We're going for the PDF, aren't we? Sorry, just got all of those technical glitches, not sure. There you go, this one. Can everybody see that okay? Brilliant. So I'm here today to talk about regenerative placemaking in the context of coupling social food reconnection with pollinator biodiversity in the public space. It's not changing. Oh wow, my screen just froze. Let me try sharing that again. Let's see if that works now. Screen. Phew, okay, that worked. Right, so the first thing that I want to do is walk you through carefully through this idea of food as a public service, because the question that I get asked most often is this just about community gardens? And it's not. It's not just about community gardens, and that doesn't mean community gardens are not important. Community gardens are vital in so many ways and provide so many benefits. But the difference is at community gardens, and I have an example displayed in this slide from Auckland. The Kilmarnock Gardens is a community garden in the Ponsonby suburb in Auckland, where you can see food ownership is displayed across the board. So essentially at community gardens, people are allocated a small piece of land that they work on. They work really hard on that. So by the time something ripens, something finally is ready to be harvested, they feel like they're entitled to it. So they own the results of their labor, right? And it's very much volunteer driven in this way. Now, the idea of food as a public service, on the other hand, would be that everybody would be welcome to harvest. So anyone and everyone would be welcome to help themselves with whatever they want, regardless if they have worked on the land or not. So that's the key difference there. Now that I explained that, I'm going to talk about food as a public service in this talk and not community gardens. More specifically, I'm going to talk about a few examples. And before I do that, I want to acknowledge my research team. So I'm here actually representing a team. I'm the principal investigator of this research project and work with Professor Daniel Exeter, one of my co-principal investigators, and Dr. David Pathamore. He's a pollinator biologist. Bikuki Kingi was our Maori advisor because we worked with a Maori community group in New Zealand. Maori are the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, and we had 4 research assistants who offered valuable contributions to the project. This would not be possible without the partnerships established outside university with Auckland Council, the Mata Mata Piako District Council, and the Iwi Trust, the Kaitiaki Trap and Train Trust, the Maori community group that I mentioned before. Lastly, last but not least, I would like to acknowledge my former employer. I'm with Murdoch University, as Jerome mentioned. I'm a lecturer in sustainable development here at Murdoch. And I joined in July, so I literally landed in Perth 3 weeks ago. And before living in Australia, I was living in New Zealand. And the University of Auckland really enabled this project, not only because of the large project grant that we got awarded and a grant in aid, but also I'm affiliated as a researcher as part of Future Cities and the Center for Climate, Biodiversity and Society. So to the right, you can see images of 2 distinct interventions. At the top there, and that's my kid climbing a tree. I have a 9-year-old, soon to be 10. So that's Monarch Park. That was a small scale intervention. Before the team got together, I was working for the Auckland Council. And the small scale intervention was very much just about planting some feijoa trees around the playground. So that kids would get in touch with some of those ideas. The Waharo intervention is a larger intervention, 400 square meters. And that's when the team got together and we did this together. So that's in New Zealand. It's a small city in New Zealand. And in 2022, that's what it looked like. And that the photo at the bottom there, the after photo, is in 2023, when everything started to blossom and ripen and become beautiful. Now, usually when I give those talks and I have a little bit more time, I take people to a trip in the past, because bridging the gap between town and country is not a new thing. I'm going to keep that slide in there just so people can refer back to those examples if they're interested. Those are a few different models that have been tried in different ways. And I would then move on to doing would be taking you in a trip to the future, which are my prior publications prior to Waharoa, when I was trying different models, working with different people, both in academia and in local government, to showcase what food as a public service could look like in different ways. But what I want to do now with my time is not going back to those older publications, but instead talking about something more exciting, which is evidence-based insights. Well, the present. In New Zealand and Australia, food as a public service is a reality in the 2 case studies that I will be presenting today. So those are the publications that are either published in 2024 or under peer review or forthcoming, from which all the images that I will be showing come from. Okay, so starting with Waharoa, it all started from a visioning session. So we had a co-design session with our partners. There were researchers there and also members of the community, the Kaitiaki Trap and Train Trust, the Maori community group that I mentioned, and the Mata Mata Piako district council employees. And there were about 10 of us. The research team sponsored some food so we could get together with that futures cone to structure a narrative that would allow us to make an assessment. Are we on board the same project? Do we share a vision? And the research team, of course, had an agenda, which is what I started out by, literally reading out loud the title of this talk. We were interested in opportunities for enacting food as a public service for both enabling social food reconnection and pollinator biodiversity in the public space. And the Kaitiaki Trap and Train Trust had their own agenda as well. And it very much aligned at the social level, because their intention was to use food as a pathway to reconnect Maori adults who left jail, to reconnect with family and society, while at the same time providing activities for their youth to stay out of trouble, meaning the social workers. And because of that, everyone would be welcome to harvest, even if they hadn't been involved in working on the land in the first place, because there was this idea of community cohesion, of belonging, and the whole social value of it all. So they saw food as a pathway to get to that. So we were totally on board the same kind of values from different perspectives. When it came to pollinator biodiversity, though, we got reactions such as, but by pollinators, you mean bees, they will sting us, and that hurts. Or when we try birds, but birds will steal our food, and we want our food, because without the food, we cannot, enable the social values. So I had this idea, and I started mentioning how wonderful it would be to have fruit trees. And they were like, yes, that would be great. And then I went on to explaining that depending on the fruits, without pollinators, you end up with fruit trees that bear no fruits. And so we reached an alignment along the lines of pollinators being needed because the ecosystem services that they could provide to offer the foods that would then enable their visions. And there was this really strong component around teaching people about food through experiences rather than words. And I've been publishing on that as well. So we also took care of soil health to ensure people wouldn't get sick as a result. And there were ideas that were developed into a to-do list, a list of planting supplies. So we wanted to ensure that these were culturally appropriate, because we were very much conscious that this was a community group, a Maori community group, and culturally appropriateness was really important. So we organized their ideas around the list, native species that could help support pollinator biodiversity and culturally appropriate food. And then we kind of reached a roadblock in which they needed funding to kick off the project. So what I did was, as the PI, I went back to get the sign-offs in place to divert a very small part of the grant towards sponsoring the planting supplies so that we could activate the site. And I'm putting those numbers up there to show you how financially inexpensive that is. So just to pause and reflect for a moment how inexpensive it is to have 400 square meters of activated site for less than $400. So that's how much it costs. And then that's where the evidence-based insights come in. And I want to acknowledge one of our research assistants, Xiao Tse. And I can see she's there because Xiao makes my job easy. She's such a talented designer, and she's the one who's responsible for making everything look so beautiful from now onwards. So this is the pollinator surveys that David conducted with another research assistant of ours, another talented RA, Mariana Vargas. And we were really excited with the results because we managed to attract 14 visiting species as a result of the Waharu intervention. On the other hand, we also conducted interviews. While David was leading the pollinator surveys, I was leading the social side of things, the interviews with our research participants. And from those coded themes, I want to speak to the most vital ones. So food teaching through experiences was a key vision that drove the project in the first place, as I mentioned, one of the key visions. We did the visioning session or the co-design session in 2022, which was checked against narratives collected last year in 2023, all the way through December 2023. And criminality, reduced criminality, and teaching people about health and well-being in that space came across quite strongly. So an interesting outcome that we didn't foresee was that people started getting together to have conversations about food. So the Kaiteki Trap and Train Trust started organizing these talks, and different members would take turns speaking about different kinds of foods that could help tackle the diet-related diseases that are skyrocketing in the region, specifically diabetes and heart-related diseases. So that was a really interesting outcome, how they were actually sitting down to talk things through, not just while working on the land or harvesting and helping themselves, but actually getting together there to cook those foods on site and have these talks and, build on those social benefits that we were aiming for in the first place. And the other interesting outcome is how their perception shifted regarding pollinators and ecosystem services. So from bees stinging and hurting and birds stealing our food, they actually changed quite a lot because they could see for themselves the importance of pollinator services and ecosystem services, and specifically pollinator biodiversity, also through the work that David did with Mariana on site. So by the time I interviewed some of them towards the end of 2023, they were saying things like, if people come in and they try to shush the bees, I say, leave the bees alone. They're helping us get the food. So that was really interesting as well, seeing food teaching on the ground, taking shape like that. Okay, so as we were doing that work, the primary data collection and data analysis last year, I was also thinking along the lines of, there's got to be some other models out there we could learn from. And the reason why we built our object of study in New Zealand was because we couldn't find a case study we could investigate. So in that sense, it was very much action research, and at the same time, very bottom up, because as I was saying, the Kaitiaki Trap and Train Trust is the community group who led the planting and continues to lead the management of the site. While the Matamata Piako District Council took leadership in facilitating a peppercorn lease, as they call it, which is $10 a year. So without that, the whole project wouldn't be sustainable in the first place. But that being said, the people who are there every day doing the planting and management of the site is still the Kaitiaki Trap and Train Trust, the Maori community group. And then I kept thinking to myself, but what about a more top-down approach, a government-led approach that not only facilitates the access to the public land, but also the actual planting and the management? What if that existed and people would be welcome to go to such a place and help themselves free of charge, regardless if they were interested in working on the land or not? And then I found it. So I found the Epicurus Garden in Brisbane, and I flew there to conduct interviews and investigate the site. Now this diagram correlates the themes from Waharoa with Epicurus Garden. And the interesting thing is a government-led model versus a community-led model. We could code from the primary data collection the same themes at the bottom there, and at the top, the themes differed. So those three different themes at the top are distinct from the bottom themes, the 7 bottom themes that they shared. And I'm gonna walk you through this high level again. So first, a little bit of information about the Epicurus Garden, right? I think that's helpful. So while Waharoa was a 400 square meter intervention, the Epicurus Garden is 1,500 square meters located at South Bank Parklands in the heart of Brisbane, very large city. City Parklands managed on behalf of Brisbane City Council, the Epicurus Garden, and Brisbane City Council is the 2nd largest local government in the world. Now, I had 2 distinct groups of participants because of those geographical characteristics. The first one was government employees, consultancy, and TV employees who were involved in the actual implementation of the Epicurus Garden. The second one was community members and visitors whom I interviewed on site. So it was a total of 19 interviews conducted. And again, I'm going to walk you the key themes. The one that I want to highlight for now is the only one that differed across those 2 groups, in the sense that sensory experiences did not emerge as a theme at all with the interviews with government, consultancy, and TV participants. Whereas among community members and visitors, that was actually flagged as a really important one. And they correlated that with notions of joy and love, and that there was quite a lot to it. All the other ones are quite interesting because they came across from both groups of participants, but they had different perspectives on each one of these. So the one thing about Epicurus that is really different to Waharoa is how it started out as a beautiful manicured edible landscape by design. And that changes everything because it's a less organic development of how you manage the land and you allocate the planting supplies. And it also allows you the opportunity to think through ecosystem services and pollinator biodiversity by design as well, which they also did. So the whole configuration of the garden, how it looks like, is quite different, as you can see in this photo. So it is manicured. It is a very prominent location, as I mentioned, in the heart of the city. And you can clearly see how it's manicured and the attention paid to the design itself. And that was part of the vision that actually enabled that particular intervention. Now, the outcome of this work was to think through a transplantable model across geographical boundaries, starting from the Epicurus intervention. And as I mentioned, it is beautiful, it's manicured, and it's done by design. But I want to start from step one. And this little model is a simple way of thinking through pathways for upscaling and reproducing food as a public service in 4 steps. And it all starts with the who. As was the case in Waharoa, you need passionate people. And in the case of government-led approaches, that would be passionate government in place who are keen to take the lead on making free food for all a permanent service offered in a public space. And that's what happened with Epicurus. Now the what. The what is the vision, right? Of what is it that you want to achieve. And in this case, the idea that it had to be beautiful and edible and beautiful, that interplay between edible and beautiful was very important. And everything was done by design. But at the same time, the vision of teaching people about food is really important. And in both cases, Waharoa and Epicurus, that came across quite strongly. How teaching people about food through experiences is more effective than words. And you know, kids go to Epicurus brought in by the teachers. So there is school visits and the teachers use the garden to teach kids about foods. I observed parents doing the same with their own children, pinching mint leaves and giving to their toddlers so they could taste that and feel what it's like. And there is also this idea of a sense of community that gets built out of it because of the kinds of experiences that you facilitate, and they're all public and accessible to all. Now, one thing that I didn't mention before, but was quite prominent in Waharoa as well, is the cost of food. And the fact that the food is free and you can help yourself and you can pretty much make dinner out of the kinds of vegetables that you're able to harvest and fruits that you can pick in both gardens was signaled as a major differential by many participants who do struggle with the cost of living, which are rising, as we all know. It's part of the cost of living crisis, isn't it? So there is a significant benefit that comes out of it all as well. And also the access to healthy foods. So not only free foods, but healthy foods, vegetables that are good for you, fruits that make you feel better. Those kinds of ideas were prominent as well. Okay, and the low cost of maintenance are also important in this what that's part of how Epicurus took shape. And that's because South Bank Corporation, even though South Bank Corporation resumed responsibility for managing the continuous maintenance of the South Bank parklands, including the Epicurus Garden, that was started out by city parklands, and they have horticulturalists, as part of their team. So it's in-house capability that also enables it all. And they have a structured volunteers program. So very different to what happened in Waharoa, because people apply to become volunteers like they would apply for a job. So people from the community who really want to give back and want to be part of this. But the volunteers program also spans across different areas in Brisbane, like the Roma Gardens and different parts of the South Bank. And people can apply to work on that. So you see friendships being forged as well as a result of that relationship with the volunteers. And the volunteers are passionate about food, so they teach people about food as they help them harvest. They also play a vital role in not letting people harvest something that's not ready. Taking care of the garden in the sense that not everything will be ready to be picked. Not because people are not welcome to do so, but because the plants need a certain time to be able to offer those foods. Okay, so the how do you get started with this all, right? And Epicurus was quite helpful to learn how a business case can be put forward across different levels of government. which is what they did, starting from city parklands. And the whole packaging of this business plan was quite interesting because it was framed by this out-of-the-box thinking around a manicured, edible landscape where everything looks trimmed and intentional by design. So when people would be put off by the idea of having foods in the public space looking kind of awkward, they would go, no, actually, we're thinking about something beautiful. We're going to do it by design. And that's how the idea really gained momentum. As I mentioned, it's low maintenance. The funding comes from state government, and it is very much grounded in a volunteers program and public servants who can take turns taking care of that space. I'm going to finish this talk with the why, because I think the why is a really important one. Even though I frame it as step 4, I think now that we have a model that's being broken down like Epicurus, and we have those 4 steps organized in this way, we can use the why to build other business cases for further upscaling and reproducing food as a public service across geographical boundaries. And the very interesting thing about Epicurus is the revenue that it generates, which is something that people don't often discuss when it comes to food in public spaces. People are often concerned about the costs, and we're already established that the costs are quite low, right? So financially inexpensive to put in place. And at the same time, it generates revenue. So Epicurus turns out to be the second most popular part of the South Bank. And they can measure that because they have those machines that count how many visitors are there daily. And it turns out 4,000 people are there daily. So it attracts a lot of people. And that revenue from tourism is harder to quantify because in a way, we know that a lot of people are going in there, but we don't know how many of them will go to that restaurant there at the corner or buy something at the shop that's just, beside the Epicurus. But we know that that flow of people will mean that this kind of economic movement will be happening as well. So it's fair to say that this is a well-grounded assumption in some evidence-based insights, given we know that 4,000 people are going there daily. Teaching children and adults about food through experience is a major why, and also proved successfully, given that there are school groups going in, and many parents have been observed doing that. And people who have been interviewed signal that as one of the things that they enjoy the most, and that drive them to Epicurus. Benefits to people struggling with food costs, as I mentioned, or access to healthy foods, or is another one. Ecosystem services by design, I think, is a major opportunity for local governments to take leadership in this regard, because if they own the maintenance of the public space as well, that's something that can be done by design and help tackle so many of our challenges in cities. The food knowledge exchange was flagged, how important volunteers were. So the volunteers program is one of the elements that is key for belonging and participation, but also in the sense that the low maintenance is also sustaining this way. And there were other ones: inspiration, new flavors, sensory experiences, the kinds of things that, make people happy, essentially. They, like I mentioned, they associate that with joy, love, and that's a beautiful thing, and health and well-being. So my new research question is, why not? Why not upscale and reproduce food as a public service across geographical boundaries? And this last slide here just quickly discloses the lessons learned from those 2 models. And in a nutshell, both approaches work. Government-led and community-led approaches work, as the Epicurus garden model and the Waharova proof of concept allowed us to articulate that argument. So it all depends on what's fit for purpose, depending on locality and geographical characteristics, but they both work. The investigative interventions are financially inexpensive, led by passionate people, and produce significant ecosystem and social values. And that's something to keep in mind, which is why, as I mentioned, my new research question is, why not? So I leave it at that. Thank you for listening. This is the complete list of references where you'll find all these images and everything that I've been talking about. Thank you very much.
That's an excellent talk. Thank you. I've learned a lot. Okay, so are there any questions from the audience first? If so, please feel free to type in. So maybe while people are typing, maybe if I may, I can ask some questions. I mean, so first, I mean, both the government-led or the community-led, I mean, projects. So how do people choose the place, choose the venue to begin with? Or do they have any ideas before they choose certain place?
That's such an excellent question, Jerome, because access to land is one of the key components, and it can be the most complicated one. I think the choice of where to do it depends on so many different things, and that will vary a lot across different localities. So for Waharoa, actually, that's what determined where the project could be done, because one of my team members, David, I talked about him quite a lot, the Pollinator Biodiversity, the Pollinator biologist who works with me. So David had some connections with the Mata Mata Piaco District Council, and it took a counselor there who really helped us by actually enabling that access to that particular site. And it used to be a former bowling green, and that's why it was, well, there was no use, essentially. It was empty and nobody was doing anything with that land. So that counselor, James, he made a case similar to what I was explaining about Epicurus. It takes a little business case put forward across different levels of decision-making processes to get those sign-offs in place. And he's the one who helped us do that. Right. So the site, to a large extent, determines where the project will take place. And at Epicurus, it was different. So there was something called, sorry, I forgot the exact name. It was something flavors that was happening, Queensland Flavors, maybe. I think it was. I'll double check and get back to you on the exact name. So it was a temporary event, a pop-up event that was happening on that site where Epicurus is nowadays. And it was really well received by the community. And like I said, there were passionate government people involved in this as well. And they saw an opportunity. They saw people coming in, they saw the influx of people across the site, and at different times of the year, it sustained itself. So they saw that there was consistent interest. They used that to put together that business case. So there was a little bit of trial experiences there, if you will, that enabled them to put forward a case for how good it would be to have a permanent intervention that would offer the kinds of values that they were identifying in the temporary interventions.
Sure. So if I may ask one more question, I mean, actually, absolutely. I have two more, but so regarding the plant choice, you say you have chosen the native plants and then to try to attract the pollinators, but do you have any planning or idea which native plant species to choose with? I mean, to begin with, or just something that are not in the surrounding environment, or I mean, or it doesn't matter. It just fit the ecosystem function. That should be okay.
Yeah, I think, well, Jerome's talk will probably cover those kinds of perspectives more thoroughly. My area is more on the social side of things. If David was here, I'm sure he would have a better answer to provide.
I mean, I'm exactly saying the same thing. I mean, if scientists can I mean, join hands, maybe provide some advice, then it may be getting even better for some of your planning. I mean, for example, I don't know. Anyway, so if we don't have any further questions, maybe thank you, Barbara. We will ask Dieter to give a talk, but after that, then we will have a big discussion with everyone. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So
okay, thank you very much.
It's an excellent talk. So now we have another distinguished scholar, Professor Dieter Hochuli, who is coming from the University of Sydney, to which he leads the Integrative Ecology Research Group. So his research focus on biodiversity response to the unique pressures of our urbanization, with particular interest in the ecology of iconic birds, mammals, insects, spiders of the cities, and the interaction with the environment and human who share the world with them. I mean, so I probably say too much, Aditya. So without further ado, it's our pleasure and honor to have Aditya. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Jerome. And thank you, Barbara. That was terrific to hear so many of those really strong, particularly the place-based generalities. Look, I'm going to speak very much from an urban ecologist's perspective. I'm really going to speak a bit about biodiversity conservation in the broadest sense. And essentially, one of the first things I just want to mention as I'm doing that is I'm working and living and speaking on Gadigal land here. There's a rich history in Australia of Indigenous people being a part of our landscape for many, many thousands of years. And I just wanted to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. Look, with respects to what I want to talk about with biodiversity conservation, one little premise to start with. A lot of conservation biology focuses very much on threatened species. My interests are really on biodiversity, much more broadly, partly because of my interest in invertebrates and the fact that they aren't really dealt with very effectively in conservation legislation, but also because cities tend to attract this real mishmash of species. And I'm going to try and make a case that we need to look at the breadth of them and why they're all important. I think we need people that champion biodiversity more broadly, even some of the less loved things. And I'll talk a little bit about connecting people to nature and why that's a catalyst for actually getting more champions and why people like ourselves should really be communicating our research and our science to the community more broadly. But in terms of where I'm going to go today, look, I'm just going to briefly, my work's been about how nature survives and thrives in cities. I'm going to briefly just mention why I think the Pacific Rim in particular is missing in many global frameworks for urban ecology. I'll then do a dive into the stuff that we've done in and around Sydney, just to give you some ideas on the breadth of things we need to be able to understand to effectively communicate the ecology of our cities to broader people. But I'm going to finish essentially by saying we've got some significant challenges. We don't understand cities globally very effectively. Even understanding the cities in which we are living and working is quite the challenge, particularly when we're looking at the complexities and details that we need to do it honestly. I'm also interested in seeing if any of the stories translate across the Pacific Rim. I think some of the things we work on actually do, despite the diversity of cultures, environmental histories, and biomes we work in. I'm probably just going to put in a little plug for, we tend to speak of ecology and nature in very broad terms, but when we're actually doing it, we focus very heavily on the nuance and detail. And I think to promote ecological literacy, we need to focus on that. So Jerome kindly showed these things. I think there's this real nexus between some of the sustainable development goals about sustainable cities and how life below water and life on land in and around our cities really matters. I work primarily on land, and when it comes to that, the thing that people will speak about constantly are trees and planting them and the contributions that plants make to their broader environment. This is just a graphic from the Nature Conservancy, but the sorts of stories about how having access to green space might increase well-being. It provides environmental services with respects to stormwater and pollution management alike. It's a very common theme, which means that a lot of the policy and practice in and around urban ecology focuses very much, not surprisingly, on trees and planting them. One of the messages that ecologists have been struggling to get out to perhaps policymakers and practitioners is that we have a very heavy focus on conservation actions in cities. We don't have the same focus on assessing conservation outcomes. So we have a lot of things in Australia, for instance, those images on the left talk about promises of trees and the importance of planting trees. One of the reasons that's important is partly because of the community engagement we have with respect to including trees. You can see on the top right there, groups of people actively regenerating. One of the really exciting opportunities in cities, which probably is a bit of a anathema to some ecologists, is the importance of things like tiny forests and small isolated plantings, and realizing that things that ecologists traditionally don't value, like that planting on the bottom right there, can actually provide significant habitat and opportunities for quite a range of fauna and flora. But in short, we want to manage green space for people and biodiversity. We probably don't really show how the actions that were there actually make cities better. You might be able to see on the right there, the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. That's very much two of the sites here that we work in. I'm actually going to return to a few of these sites and really talk about some of the things that are happening in and around essentially a city of 5 million people. But just the first tangents, just basically to talk about global approaches and just talk about some really interesting work that's come out a couple of years ago about the extreme selection pressures that cities impose. This is the kind of work which I was lucky enough to be involved on, but essentially trying to see if, in this case, white clover was responding to the selection pressures imposed by cities. It's one of those traditional nature science papers where you publish with about 400 people you've never met. But one of the things that was really persuasive about this was that it gave us a chance to see if cities were behaving similarly across the world. It was a very inclusive and rewarding project. The point I wanted to make is first that if you look at where work was included, you'll see very clearly there's large parts of the planet that weren't included. If you look at global ecology broadly, you'll realize that it's very conventional for significant parts of the planet not to be included in these broad analyses. I've tried to focus on the Pacific Rim here, so you're about to see a very clumsy snipping of this diagram to try and look at the Pacific Rim. Essentially, what's really interesting there is that I think this is probably the big opportunity that should come out of something like this association. I think significant centres of urbanisation and biodiversity aren't represented on this map. It's similar for a lot of global ecology. Some of the usual suspects are there, parts of the west coast of the US, Japan, and the bottom east part of Australia, but there's large chunks that are missing. In terms of why it's important, and apologies for the messy picture here, but this is 160 cities from 26 countries. The only point I wanted to make with respects to this is there was a coherent signal and a response of the white clover to urbanisation, but it wasn't consistent across cities. So this is just looking at these graphs through here. Essentially, if there was a coherent signal that you expect everything to be doing the same, there's clearly some very significant variations among cities. So there was a signal, but it was for some and not all cities. And all this really reinforced to me is that we need to get the story straight within our cities to really be able to make informed conversations about what's happening across cities. So I'm going to speak very much now about place-based approaches and focus very much on the places that we've worked. So this is Sydney, Australia. We're very lucky to have a natural legacy in terms of having some relatively intact spaces that have changed. They've changed dramatically since European colonisation, but they're still bearing a strong resemblance to them. I just want to highlight this tower here in the corner because I'm going to refer to that when I speak to some of the iconic animals. And I think the message I'm going to want to go through in the next sort of 10 minutes or so is really about how do we understand how what can be quite a hostile environment for nature can support biodiversity. I'm going to try and make a case that we need to use place-based approaches that look at multiple scales and multiple scopes. The multiple scales mean we need to look at landscape, large level kinds of approaches, but also look at what's happening at really fine grains, like those tiny forests I showed earlier. But also realize it's not enough for us to focus on one species or a couple of species. We need to be able to communicate the breadth of biodiversity responses, both loved, threatened species and iconic species. The pollinators that Barbara mentioned too, I'll be referring to them as well. I'm a big fan of everyone that visits flowers. I'll also speak about how there's a flip side to greening our cities, and that is that biodiversity in many cases can provide threats to human health. That's a global phenomenon. I'll talk about the ecology of invasion and recolonisation briefly because of how it relates to human and wildlife conflict, and then just finish off with a bit about species. So what I'm going to do, this is being recorded, so if you want to, I'll talk about much of the work that I'm talking about is previously published, so the references will be on here, but I'm also happy to send them to you if anything piques your interest and you'd like to read more about them. So I'll be giving the big picture overview. First animal I wanted to talk about is the powerful owl. It's an endangered owl that actually has managed to, well, it's a threatened owl, not endangered, but it's a large owl. It's about 40 centimeters tall when standing up. It's got this habit of catching its prey and then sitting on it all day and feeding on it. And one of the things it's managed to do is actually successfully roost and forage in our cities. So that image in the middle, you might be able to make out just on the top left, that tower that I mentioned. This is literally 300 or 400 meters from the harbour and the Opera House. we put some backpacks on these animals, so these little solar-powered backpacks here, to try and look at how these animals were responding to urbanisation and how they're moving. And the simple message I wanted to show is that by tracking their movements through the urban space, so that large, big chunk of yellow there is showing mainly the CBD and the Royal Botanic Gardens, we found that these animals were moving throughout the city to quite a wide range of places, using a whole lot of these stepping stones. So there's a hotspot analysis on the right through here. But in terms of animating it over about a week's movement, this is an image of a powerful owl moving through the city and essentially looking at how it navigates through the city. And the simple message here is that green spaces, in this case, green spaces with large old trees, were providing the important stepping stones for it to move around, forage, and in some cases even roost. I've just got the brutal photograph here of the powerful owl, which many of us love, with a baby koala that it's foraging on, which a lot of people also love. It's a great story about how nature actually works. It's a really interesting part of the planet. So the first point here is green stepping stones and small bits matter. Ecologists focus very much on big chunks of nature. We need to take a deep breath in cities and realize the small bits matter. In terms of the small bits matter, pollinators, I don't need to make a case. Barbara made a massive case for those in the previous talk, but this is an introduced honeybee on an introduced plant. We're also interested in how a lot of our native bees respond to, and our other native pollinators respond to a range of interventions. One of the things many of you might have in your cities are things like bee hotels. There's a real culture of producing nesting habitat for native bees. We found that when we put these out, they provide fabulous habitat, but for wasps rather than bees, which we really like wasps too. They're really important. But the bees didn't work as much as what we've found with respects to planting the spaces. So on the right there, you can see an image of Sydney. We just sampled a range of areas with different levels of urbanisation. I'll just put the map of Sydney next to it. It's basically looking at the eastern half of Sydney. And we looked at whether landscape traits and habitat traits influenced where pollinators were going to live, as well as a range of other major groups of insects. So this was a really simple landscape level and habitat level assessment of what are the things that really matter. And this was with a goal to saying, well, these are the things that might matter with respects to planting sites to promote insects in these areas. So there's two images here. The ones with the yellow bars there on the left are really habitat attributes. And this was basically just compelling evidence that more diverse areas with respects to their plant communities supported more diverse communities of insects. It was fairly consistent with a lot of the stuff that we've done previously, but it just points to the importance of, say, moving away from monospecific plantings and the like. On the right, these graphs on the right were really interesting because these looked at landscape attributes. We found that different groups responded to different attributes. So things like the proportion of green space within 2 kilometres or the proportion of green space in 1 kilometre, essentially what the little stepping stones were in between. So we looked at a range of different traits. And the simple point to take out of this is we can actually identify what's happening both at a landscape scale and a habitat scale to see which things we might be able to manipulate or promote in our plantings to improve the habitat for these animals. Just a quick look at one of our favourite groups. We talk about native bees all the time and the importance of bees. We forget far too readily, it was great to see them on Barbara's talk, that flies are as, if not more important as pollinators in some parts of the world. The hoverflies that we work on was the next part of our work. I think it showed us a few interesting things. We looked at a much deeper dive into the hoverflies. Two things to take off this particular set of images from this paper that came out last year. The one that was really interesting is that our plants were driving some parts of whether the hoverflies were persisting, but they weren't as fussed about native plants as a lot of our planting policy would suggest. And this will be common for a lot of people that study pollinators. It's not rocket science to realize that pollinators typically really, really like places with lots of flowers. That's not necessarily saying you should avoid native plants. It's just realizing they were tracking the resources in many of these areas. So the proportion of natives was almost secondary to just making sure there were lots of flowers in these areas to promote these groups. The second part that was really interesting is we're in Australia's largest city with, you know, a couple hundred years of Western science. We still don't have good species levels identification on some of our groups. This is a group called Melangina. It's a species complex. They're our most common hoverflies. And it just shows you how little we know about how much. You may hear some fire testing in the background. I just heard our fire alarms being tested at the moment. I'm sorry about that. A bit of a negative story. One of the things that happens when you green a city is things come back. And it's really important to realize that that can actually mean that things you may not like are returning back to the city. So ticks in Australia are a relatively small problem with respects to the potential challenges and breadth of problems they cause, but they cause spotted fever and typhus. They cause a meat allergy. There's a Lyme-like disease called debilitating symptom complex. That's DSCATT, attributed to ticks. It also causes tick death and paralysis in dogs. So there's a real issue with respects to people living close to natural areas and potentially being affected by ticks. We've done some work to try and look at how our paralysis tick, the Australian paralysis tick, Ixodes holocyclus, responds to greening and the return of native and non-native animals. The simple message that's going to come out of this part is it's only in a very small part of the city. If you look at the top right of that map, it's on a suburb called our Northern Beaches. It's a very leafy suburb, lots of natural areas. We went out and collected native animals and introduced animals. They're anaesthetized, so that's why the possum looks a bit sleepy in the top there. Ticks were removed from them. The bandicoot, this animal, this native marsupial on the bottom here, is seen as public enemy #1 with respects to being a tick host. We collected a range of ticks and found that, yes, bandicoots actually have significantly more numbers of ticks than possums, but also many more than rats, about 10-fold. But what we found in this graph is that even though there were about 10 times as many ticks on our bandicoots, there were 10 times as many rats that our people were interacting with. So there's a range of work here where we've tried to look at who the enemies may be with respects to supporting ticks, but also just which hosts are important and how you can potentially manage those. So a lot of that work's come out in the last 2 or 3 years. But with respects to understanding habitat traits and landscape traits, there's a really well-known path, particularly in North America, showing that there are host environment interactions that are real drivers of whether ticks are going to become a problem. So we actually looked at a range of these sorts of things in the Northern Beaches to see whether it was yard level interactions or landscape level interactions that were driving the potential risks of ticks being encountered by humans, because it is an issue with respects to living in these areas. The greener areas seem to be tick infested, so you need to take personal responsibility, but we're trying to work out whether the ecology of having our native animals coming back into these areas is leading to a tick problem. So just briefly, Casey Taylor led this work through these hot spots. And essentially we found that, as you might expect, living close to natural areas increased your risk of encountering ticks, as did having lots of pets and having certain traits of your yard traits. A simple little point. And the reason I wanted to raise is there's not so much to talk about ticks, but talk about human-wildlife conflict in cities is a really critical part of our understanding of the ecology of areas, whether it's snakes and sharks in the top left in Australia, the pigs on the walk down from the peak in Hong Kong. We've got Vancouver's coyotes. There's a raccoon in Portland, Oregon that was biting people. We have a lot of birds that swoop people. As much as I love nature, I think it's important that we recognise the shortcomings or the challenges of working with it. And it's not just things that can cause harm, they can also be annoying. I've actually got a book here in front of me called Amazing Annoying Birds, which is about this bird, the brush turkey. We study these animals. They're an animal that declined significantly historically from our cities. They have returned and returned in numbers. As you can see on the bottom left there, they turn up. These are large birds that are probably, well, imagine, almost goose-like essentially. They build a mound with about 1,000, basically a ton of leaf litter. They cover it from your gardens. We wanted to work out just how they were moving and returning back to cities. We have a citizen science program where we tag turkeys, watch them move through the city. Matt Hall was leading this work. We found that most of our turkeys, when they get somewhere nice, stay there. But we also found that this is a turkey here that we actually found was walking around the university, and we tagged it. It moved 20 kilometres from the, or about 15 kilometres from the university down to a southern part of the city. One of the things that we need to do is realise that as you green a city, simple story, things are going to return. And we've just published a piece of work that we're very proud of the title, The Decline, Fall and Rise of a Large Urban Colonising Birds, because this animal is a really polarising animal. It's loved by some people, and as this tweet shows here, it's hated by some, because these turkeys will go and move your entire garden into a 1-ton pile. So the final bit I wanted to talk about is the human dimensions, if you'll just indulge me for a couple of minutes. The map on the left here shows where our turkeys live. If you translocate that map to the right, they're living basically in our relatively wealthy parts of Sydney, where there's, there's on one side to the left there, there's lower income, lower education, lower health benefits, there's higher cultural diversity, high unemployment. The thing that's interesting from us is that also tracks very closely with access to green space and the benefits of these sorts of urban trees. So my final point is really just to have a bit of a dive into what we know about humans and the benefits of green space and nature and human well-being. I guess one of the things that's important is, as an ecologist, I love all the nature bits, but increasingly I've got to make a stronger case for why it matters to people. And I think one of the most compelling arguments we've got is self-interest. There's so many benefits to making the city greener and support making them more sustainable through things like these replanting efforts. So Lucy Taylor was a PhD student. One of the things that challenged me with Lucy's work was that our very conventional conservative perspectives about what matters from an ecological perspective, which is native species, threatened species, didn't matter to a lot of the normal people outside. They're very keen on things that looked good. They were very keen on just having green near them that was accessible. And the accessibility part was absolutely critical. The importance of nature near you was really important. So you can see Lucy's work down here if you'd like, but essentially it really had me shifting my thinking away from the very conventional perspectives. Final bit about kids. We've also looked at whether people are connected to things. This is a global phenomenon in many parts of the world. It's got the same gaps in the Pacific Rim as many others, but there's a massive drop-off. Ryan Keith on the top left led this work. Around 11 or 12 years of age, there's a massive drop-off in connections to nature with children. It's a really interesting notion called the adolescent dip, and it's something that I think we urgently need to understand and do a better job of just trying to help manage, because those connections to nature have so many benefits, not only for pro-environmental behaviours, but for well-being benefits as well. So I'm going to make a final call with respect to urban things. I think we underexplore our cities. I think we have extraordinary things living in and around us. I think we need to look beyond those classic threatened and iconic species, even though they're worth working on. I feel like those untold stories of how, in my case, my turkeys have got back, how my flies are just as important as my native bees, need to be told, and told more widely. We've put out a book a couple of years ago about trying to reimagine the naturalist tradition away from the colonialist perspectives of the past, just to get into exploring and looking and learning from it. But my final points are really these challenges at the bottom. As an ecologist, we struggle to understand cities at a global perspective. What are the general principles that can be used? We also have a lot of trouble just understanding a single city, the single cities we live in. We've got so little work to understand so much. We don't really celebrate the complexities and the detail. We tend to use these high-level things like canopy cover and replanting efforts without really acknowledging that we haven't actually tested how effective many of these interventions are. And my final point is really, I think there are interesting stories in all of your cities. And I think one of the great opportunities with the APRU is to see if whether these stories can translate across Pacific Rim cities. I was really struck by the Vancouver, Hong Kong, Portland, Sydney human wildlife story. I think there's a lot of cities, despite our differences, our cultural diversity, there's a lot of things that are playing out very similarly in many cities. So thank you very much for your time. Apologies for going over time.
Okay, thank you, Dieter. It's an excellent talk. Really, really good. So let's see whether there's any question from the chat box. If you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat box. And while you're typing, so I mean, I take this opportunity to ask the question. So, Dieter, I mean, so for a very nice example about the inside the city, the migration. I mean, on the out, and you put in the sensor, etc. But how about I don't know whether anyone have done or maybe your work have shown any for example, migratory birds across cities. I mean, are they having similar pattern that I mean they more go to the green non-urban space and then they go at night and then come back. I mean, so are
Yeah,
they, yeah, sorry, yeah.
oh, no, sorry. I should let you finish your question, Jerome. Sorry.
I finished. So yeah, I just see that there are, I mean, other examples of other migratory birds. I mean, when they across the cities, I mean, then that would be probably a kind of a blueprint for your last question. I mean, they can be across different cities. Yeah.
I think that's a really important question, and it translates to the global phenomenons as well as the local ones. From a global perspective, the really obvious ones are potentially wetlands birds and things like Ramsar wetlands. I think one of the things that happens in cities is that there's often certain spaces that are highly desirable for development. And if we're going to have people in cities, you're going to have housing. A lot of these migratory birds show a lot of fidelity to the places that they like to move through, to go from north to south. Like we've got birds in Australia that overwinter in some parts of the the northern hemisphere, and they move through. They're going via Australia through China, and there's some extraordinary animals. And one of the things that happens is that when we disrupt their habitat through urbanization, in our cities, the potential for catastrophic declines in these quite amazing animals is a real issue. So it's probably quite a negative story with respect to the impacts on migratory birds from the colleagues I've been part of. At a more local level, even something as simple as a wetland bird, what happens is that as people move into places where they weren't previously, little things like introducing black rats or introducing more dogs, they're the sorts of things, because say shorebirds are a good example of animals that might be, they often build their nest on the ground and the shore. So they're pretty resilient. They've been able to do it for thousands of years. But if you introduce a new predator like a black rat, or you introduce intervention by dogs, or dysplasia by dogs, dysplasia is not a word, I'm sorry, that's but just displacement by birds, by dogs, is a really big thing at a more local level. And so the really big migrations, I think there's a really good body of work, that there's a significant urbanization is a significant threatening process by draining wetlands. I mean, sometimes wetlands and swamps are sometimes seen as undesirable because of, if you've ever been around a mosquito-ridden place, we've done, it's very hard to make a case for mosquitoes. The second part about the migration that's interesting, we also have birds in Australia that are migrating from the southern part 2,000 or 3,000 kilometres to the northern part during the winter here. And one of the things that's been interesting is that we've been finding these birds aren't threatened, but they're small birds that actually navigate the landscape through the stepping stones that I think are silver eyes and things called grey fantails, which are just basically some of the birds that are most at risk in Australia because of cats. So we're actually finding they're actually migrating and jumping through some of those small plantings that people have put together. So that's so I'm sorry for the long answer, but the short answer is I think there's a really significant threat with those migratory birds that are going long distances because of the massive changes to the areas that they show a lot of fidelity to. But I think there's a little positive story in that the replanting of small places can actually contribute to things moving through. Does that answer your question, Jerome?
Yes, I mean, that's very nice. I mean, yeah, it's very clear. Thank you. Yeah. So we also have a question in the chat box. So it's from Gail. So it's asking about what are your thoughts on the design of urban green spaces? Is it possible to design a system that filters out unwanted organisms but brings in the beneficial one? Like you said, you have green space, you invite a diversity of organisms, and sometimes we want, sometimes we don't. Many people want to design this type of design rather than being willing to more broadly interact with a diversity of good and bad. Can this type of system be designed, or is it more important to try and how folks accept broader biodiversity?
Thank you very much for your question, Gail. I'm familiar with your work, and I'm very excited to see your name there, because you do some terrific work on small spaces and pollinators. But so if you look up Gail's publications, I'd really recommend that. But yeah, I think my feeling is that one of the big things is that changing the hearts and minds down at the bottom, because one of the things about trying to over-engineer solutions can be a real challenge. Certain animals will manage to navigate those landscapes despite our best efforts. Like in Australia, we have a lot of issues with free-ranging cats eating a lot of our native fauna. It's very hard. I can understand why it's a really manageable problem potentially in some places with predator-proof fences. In cities, I think you're talking about an unwinnable game. But with respects to the helping people accept broader biodiversity, I think that when I say winning hearts and minds, I actually think there's a lot of enormous personal benefit from learning to engage with some of the less promoted or loved species, understanding their stories, realizing that the turkey paper that's coming out shows that they were almost hunted to extinction in the 1920s and 30s. That was around the time the city developed into a concrete, and the suburbs turned into very concrete areas. And we think that we're basically confident they're returning because we've regreened the city, and one of the consequences of that is you've got to learn to live with them. You know, in terms of helping accept broader biodiversity, you know, I think celebrating the wins is really critical. So I suppose you mentioned in terms of designed green spaces and filtering out unwanted organisms. I think it's I've seen it in the entomological world with respects to dealing with plantings for pests in agricultural and horticultural contexts. I think you can in a very closed system you might be able to do it, but even then you're going to have to accept a certain amount of leakage with a lot of those sorts of things. I think trying to create green spaces that are engaging for people is a really critical part. I think one of the things that we've tried to promote extensively is the importance of, when you're going out into the great outdoors, not worrying about going from A to B, but just going to A and hanging there and watching. I mean, I know there's a few people from Hong Kong here, but you know, I was lucky enough to spend some time there in February, and I'm still actively reflecting on the butterfly community you people have, and what an incredible gift you have as a landscape. You have the most amazing group of animals, and I'm sure they were just the stock standard, you know, junk butterflies, but learning to celebrate the fact that some of these animals are actually persisting is really good. I think so. Gail, this is a long-winded answer. I don't know if there's much evidence you can design something. You can make claims to, but I don't reckon, you know, that whole notion of nature finding a way. A lot of these animals that you're trying to keep out are opportunists, generalists, resilient. You can do certain things, you know, fences and so on, but you know, if it comes to a toss-up between lots more green space close to where people are, so filling in the gaps, compared to investing very heavily in active maintenance, because I don't think you can design a system that filters. I think it's an ongoing maintenance thing. So that's my short answer is I'm probably a very big fan of trying to encourage people to accept broader biodiversity and realize that, you know, I'll keep telling people that flies are just as important as bees. I know some flies are really annoying, but you know, they do an incredible job visiting our flowers and pollinating them. So just, you know, the whole notion that we wouldn't have chocolate on this planet if it wasn't for fly pollinators, you know, that's one of the more persuasive arguments, but that's not a sustainable cities thing, but that's it. So yeah, sorry, you're getting very long answers. I'm really sorry for that, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we have one more question in the chat box. So it's from Melissa. So thanks. I really enjoy the presentations. So in my world, I mean, outside Brisbane, we all love frogs, and this has led my street and area to become very active in toast busting. So I'm familiar with the wonderful frog ID, but wonder if that mode of recording, identifying, knowing your submissions are used to help understand how to protect creatures. Is also active in other species groups like birds. I also used to record roadkills, but that discontinued. So
Yeah, that's a really great. Thank you, Melissa, for that question. I think citizen science is it's a really challenging thing because it's one of those things where it's very popular amongst ecologists. It was for a while there we had it in all of our our outreach things. We're trying to work out how best to do it. You've mentioned one of the probably one of the most successful ones in our country anyway, Frog ID, which is where people record. You basically go out with your phone, you hear a frog, you record it, you send it to the people, and they tell you what frog a few days later you found, and it's like one of because quite often you won't even see these frogs very often. You'll just hear them. In terms of that model I think it's incredible. I think you have to what we have to realize is it doesn't have to suit everybody. I mean, sometimes we have a very top-down perspective on what works, and our metrics are how many people used it, how many recordings have gone, perhaps what papers are there. But there's an increasing body of work that, well, one of them is that unstructured citizen science observations can actually be a lot more informative and useful than we've treated them in the past, because it's been sort of random and haphazard. So that's from a scientific perspective. But one of the things we've found with the Big City Birds app is that we end up with some super users, and they become quite strong advocates for the animals that they're working on. So I think sometimes there's a lot of work that goes into some of the community outreach, and I imagine if many of you have ever gone out and spoken to community groups that are interested in the places that you're working, you may have had those moments where you turn up and you have a very intimate gathering with not many people. And I think it's really important to realize that they can be just as important when you're speaking to, I mean, we're lucky enough to have over 50 people on this chat, but sometimes just those one or two chats, I find with my lab group, one of the things I think is really critical, Melissa, is to actually get them to, if they get cornered in the field by someone asking what they're doing, that they have an elevated pitch or an explanation of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I've found that it doesn't take much for people to find their group of animals, whether it's birds. So in Australia, we have birds in backyards and a range of things. You mentioned roadkills. I think those things can be useful, but I think that they can be quite confronting for people. But there's so many positive stories, whether it's iNaturalist or a specific one or eBird that people use. There are a lot of citizen science projects, probably a little bit too many for them to be effective. But I think because it splits us quite a lot. But I think I go back to going, well, you just have to find that small group of people. I love it. You mentioned your street. I think that bottom-up approach where community groups, you get that little buzz about what you really like, whether, and it could be your butterflies, it could be staring at flowers. So I think that it's a way of engaging that really works for some people, and I would recommend it thoroughly. So.
Yeah, I think that's very good, because I mean that actually comes into another question that maybe I want to ask both of you. I mean, Babara and Peter, because both of you involve citizens, but of course, I mean, to very different aspect. But I mean, couldn't that be actually doing something similar together at the same time? For example, when you have a community garden, then you can actually do some citizen science together at the same time. Then, I mean, I wonder if that is just something too naive to think about, or would that be possible?
Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks, Dieter. Jerome, could you repeat that, please? Your
Yeah, so
question.
for example, now, I mean, when you have your community garden, right? So you ask people to come in, and of course, I mean, free food, and then plant things. But at the same time, I remember your slide, you also show that you will also educate the children, for example. So educate them what is happening. So I mean, at some point, I also see Dieter's work in more law for citizens. I mean, reporting, of course, I mean, in that case with birds, but I mean, let's think about any other species. I mean, not birds or any other thing that may be able to see in your community garden, for example. So can you actually make an integration? I'm not asking you to, but I mean, that kind of model. So you can actually have a model that people can do citizen science at the same time, but actually also benefiting the local community. I mean, by the model that Babara has mentioned. I don't know. I mean, it's just a thought for discussion. Well, I don't know whether that's possible.
Oh, that's thank you for that. So do you mean if we could couple both experiences and further enhance teaching people not only about food but also about ecosystem services?
Yes.
That's such a great question. Those earlier publications in which I explored visions, for alternative futures, I did give a go at some designs for including also interactive games and those kinds of elements in public spaces, so that people could better understand, and those devices could translate what they were experiencing into a more digestible knowledge. I have a kid, so as I mentioned, so I can see how far games go in the sense of making learning more fun, because I think that's a little bit of what's missing in the conversation, making these experiences more engaging and fun and lightening up a little bit, because it's all so heavy, isn't it? The challenges we're facing, and people, they tend to get paralyzed if they feel like they cannot do anything about it, or even worse, just let it go, because what's the point anyway? So if we make it more fun, interactive, and engaging, I think we can inspire people to care more about what's going on, and also learn about the massive challenges that we're facing and the kinds of things they could do. And by the way, while I'm still on, I just wanted to give you a follow-up answer on that question. So the name of the event was Regional Flavors, the temporary pop-up event that was happening where Epicurus now sits. Regional Flavors. So that's why I think it came to mind Queensland, because it's the region, but the actual name of the event was Regional Flavors. Thanks.
Thank you. Right. No. So, okay. Okay, so that Melissa just have another comment to say, yes, there are many compounding benefits, including extension to other social media. I mean, so thank you, Dita. So, yeah. So it seems that we thank both speakers. I mean, I think this is the kind of okay. So I still have time. I mean, I was reminded I still have time, so we can keep on discussing. Okay, that's good. So no, I mean the reason that I think this webinar series that we are trying to do is it's not just biologists or ecologists. I mean, or just social scientists, because the way to which that we do is as Babara and Dita mentioned, it matters. It matters to us, to our next generation. But the way that we are now doing seems to be slightly separate. Of course, we are doing great things, but can we actually try to do something together? I mean, that's why I asked that question, Babara. So I'm just thinking, I mean, of course, we keep on doing our thing, but if we can put in some other elements, we may be able to foster a new, not just collaboration, but a way to get a new role. I mean, that would be something that would be able to help us in another dimension. For example, killing two birds with one stone. I mean, if you're doing your program, at the same time, in addition, of course, increase biodiversity, etc., but you can also nurture the next generation force, like what Dita has been trying to do on Citizen. That's what I've been trying to think. I mean, I know it's too naive. I know, Dita, you're laughing, but yeah, I mean, that's why. I mean, and yeah, I wonder. I mean,
sorry, Jerome, I misunderstood your question. Thanks for further clarifying that. I actually think there is huge opportunities for collaboration, and for us to get together and do things together. That's what I did with David. So when you asked me about more specific questions about species, it was like, I wish David was here. Because our experience working interdisciplinary, which is where now I understand it's where you're going with this, right?
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. So it has been so enriching. I mean, I learned so much from David. For starters, I could only think about bees, and as we could all see in Dieter's great presentation, and also as I've been learning with David, there's so many different kinds of pollinators out there. They vary from a range of bats, birds, all different kinds of bees, not only honey bees, but native bees and different kinds of bees, and and even those tiny lizards that take ages to move around, but they are pollinators too, and I didn't know that. So I think the opportunities for collaboration and learning from each other are there, and I think that this forum here that you're enabling is really important. you know, it's really vital to have those opportunities to exchange ideas and know about each other's work so that we can seize those opportunities. I really enjoyed your presentation, by the way, Dieter.
Yeah, I think.
So yeah, thank you, Barbara, for the kind words. Well, Jerome, I was laughing at the idea you just talked about you're out there killing birds with your stones, and I thought, oh no, that's not. That's so. I think you've made a really important point, Jerome, and Barbara's point about the chance to learn with each other, even within our institutions. I think one of the things, if you're lucky enough to work in a university, you realize they're quite amazing places. There's incredibly talented people that do things and think very differently to the way you might do them. But it's often quite hard to meet the ones that might be right for you. But when you do, it's a really exciting part. And even at my age, as you're getting close to the end, you start getting, your thinking gets challenged, and that's what universities should do. So the first thing is, even at local scales, just having those partnerships and those collaborations, it really does end up helping create something bigger than the individual bits. One of the challenges, though, for especially younger researchers coming through, as you are increasingly being encouraged to focus on finer grained specialties, and it's hard to invest the time. I'm sure Barbara can attest to this, just building the relationships and trying to learn how they think and how they do stuff. So the first thing is, I think that idea of killing the two birds with one stone is actually, it's really powerful, because it's also beneficial for us as researchers, but you can, it helps you find different ways of communicating a similar thing, because we'd all know that people are very, very different. They're not going to like every bit. I imagine Barbara had some people that really like the bugs, other people really like the food. There's a whole lot of different ways that you can go about that. But there's a really big question, and I do think that the Pacific Rim broadly is underrepresented in some of these big general things. And if you look at the diversity of cultures and cities, I think it's extraordinary that we've got any commonalities, but we do. I reckon we really do, in terms of, like even, again, I was struck by Hong Kong's the massive difference between urban and non-urban, how they sat on each other, and just all the opportunities that provided, and the way that people were exploring and using them when we were there. It's the same. I showed a photograph of Vancouver, and it's a park in the middle of the city there that's got that. I think there's surprising commonalities when you look for them, and I think one of the important things that the APRU should be trying to do is making sure that when these global analyses come out, that there are more dots in that Pacific Rim, and sometimes it's just through organic conversations and chats. I don't have any big picture projects like that at the moment, but I think that's a really critical thing. But I really feel strongly that you and Barbara nailed that there's so many possibilities, even bringing together the biodiversity and sustainable cities crew, Jerome. I think there's so much overlap and potential for impact, because you've got the biodiversity, it's where the people are. It's not about nature and humans being different. It's a really great opportunity. So I'm going back on mute, but yeah, I think that was a really important question you asked. So thank you.
Yeah, I think both of you, I couldn't agree more. It's really the way, because as a biologist or ecologist, the way that we see is, I think Dieter mentioned very nice. Urban ecology, different cities, those are not, that needs to be explored. But at the same time, when I try to take a look at sometimes the urban design, I also don't understand why you designed it like that. If you design it another way, then biodiversity could be slightly different. So I think there are lots of opportunities, but people haven't really asked before, so that's why we have this webinar series. I know time. Thank you. Okay, so Greg. Again, we must thank our two distinguished scholars. Very, very nice talks. I've learned a lot. Babara and Dieter. So thank you. So I was also asked that I need to announce the ECAN. Yes, thank you. So we are going to have the third webinar series between SCL and biodiversity in APRU. So which is going to be in October, mid-October. So please register if you're interested in this kind of interaction, and we look forward to seeing you soon. So again, of course, amazing work and great talk for everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for all the contribution. We'll see you next time. Okay. Thank you, Babara. Thank you, Dieter. Bye-bye.